Whenever I do something good, you can clap for me as well. Nothing wrong with clapping. I haven't done anything good, so save it for when it's meaningful. Welcome once again. As previously advertised, we're going to cover 3 John. We went through 1 John last week. We were able to get through all of 2 John, and we'll do the same for 3 John, short little letters that we are able to finish in one Sunday. What you will notice in 3 John, once we get into it, it has a shared theme with 2 John, the theme of walking in truth. John is going to repeat this sentiment, but in a way that is a little bit more evident as to what he means by walking in truth. Basically, he's going to give us examples as to what that looks like in practice and in real life. Let's get started. I'll read all the way through. If you don't have your Bibles, you might have to just listen to me, or do we have a projection? We do? All right, so you can look up as well. Again, all 15 verses, or is it 15? 14. All right. The elder, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified to the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers for the truth. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has a good testimony from all, and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. Verse 13. I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink, but I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. So once again, John introduces himself as the elder. He did this in 2 John, and now we see this again. And I mentioned before that very likely John here is not referring to a position. We know that there is a position of the church, an office called the elder or the elders, these leaders, these pastors. Very likely this is not what John is referencing here. He is purely just referencing his advanced age. Again, the apostle that lived the longest, so he was able to see how the church, the early church, developed and considered them his children, the younger portion of the family of Christ, and him being the elder or one of the elders. And what we notice in this letter, it's that it's very un-John-like. When we think of the Apostle John, we think of this, the apostle whom Jesus loved. Very meek, very nice guy. We don't, very unlike Peter, for example, and even Paul, who are very brash and harsh, didn't measure words. We don't see that with John. But again, here, he was already advanced in age. And by the way, this does not apply to anyone in here. But you know how when you get a little older, your filter starts to unwind and loosen? And prior to that age, whatever that age may be, you're a little more cautious with your words, right? A little bit more politically correct. Didn't want to hurt people's feelings. Again, just very measured. As you advance in age, you just don't care anymore. And whatever pops into your head, you just speak, especially if it is the truth. And here, it's kind of what we see with John, because he is giving examples, but not only good examples, but bad examples. And he's not afraid to name drop. He's literally pointing to certain people, positive, but also negative. So evident that John has transitioned into this new version of himself. But again, as previously mentioned, this is a helpful letter because it does share the main theme of the previous one, which is walking in truth. But now we have examples as to what John meant or what he looked for to evaluate whether or not someone was walking in truth. And we have good examples, but we also have bad examples, examples not to follow. So after introducing himself, the elder, John, mentions who this letter was primarily written to. This guy named Gaius, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Now, there are other people named Gaius in the Bible. There are references to this name in Acts, in 1 Corinthians, in Romans, but we don't know if he is referencing those Gaiuses or Gaius I don't know. Because it was a very common name. So this may be or may not be the same person or those people, but it doesn't really matter because one way or another, it's still a useful letter. So initially here, after mentioning the love that he had for this particular Gaius, on verse 2, John blesses him with a hope or a wish. He says, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." So John understood that Gaius' spiritual health was very good. It was advanced. It was in tip-top shape. And his hope and wish for Gaius was that just like his spiritual health was very good, he wished his physical health to be just as good and lined up to it. Do you see that? Do you see how that's his hope? Which is a blessing, but it could also be a curse. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree? Because if Gaius was not, and the other person who is not here, that we'll get to eventually, if they were not very healthy spiritually, just imagine if your physical health and even physical appearance always matched up. Thank God it doesn't, for some of us, right? We wish, and I wish, excuse me, I was always in a position such as Gaius, that if this was possible, that my appearance and physical health would match up with my excellent spiritual health. Partly because it is easier for us to masquerade, manipulate, camouflage our physical ailments. Spiritually speaking, not as easy for God and for those who can assess that. For example, some of you know I have an old truck, and recently I've been working a lot on it. I'm trying to tinker with welding. Mike there and Ken, who live by me, every once in a while they drive by and they see the car parked in the garage. It's a bigger truck, so I can't park all of the truck in the garage. So usually the bed of the truck is sticking out. Obviously the garage door is opened. And this particular day, usually I work a lot on Saturdays on it. I was on the bed of the truck, again, sticking out of the garage door open, but you know how there's always that last layer of the garage door that sticks down a little bit, right? So I was walking on the bed because I was going to get something near the cabin, and I swear to God, it was like it wasn't even there. I just walked right through the garage door. Saw stars for a while, shook it off, rubbed some dirt on it, and continued to work. Because I'm a man. I'm a manly man. Eventually stopped working, cleaned up, and then went to the bathroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and I was like, man, that doesn't look good. That was worse than I thought. But, you know, being a manly man, no problem. Washed myself, cleaned myself. Eventually went to bed. When I woke up, I looked at myself in the mirror again. I was like, man, now it's really bad. And the problem is that was Saturday, now it's Sunday morning. And I have to do this, especially on camera. And I didn't have a natural shiny forehead. I wish it was more of a matte finish, but usually it's a little bit more shinier. But just imagine this with like a bunch of other, you know, cruddy stuff. And I can't do that. I got to fix this. So I, went over the next drawer. We have a dual sink type of deal. Went next drawer over, and I was picking out some cover-up, makeup, the wife stuff. I'm going to fix this. And I fixed it, pretty well, to the point where I'm sure most of you didn't notice it. Not even my wife. Because that evening on Sunday, obviously I went home and I washed the makeup off, and we were having dinner. She looked at me and she's like, "What happened to you?" And I was explaining, yesterday I did this, and I was like, I didn't notice it. I was like, well, because I put makeup on. And ever since, now I'm applying makeup on her, because I am so good at it that she's just given up, and now I am the makeup artist in the family. Point being, it's very easy for you to camouflage, masquerade, cover up physical blemishes. Not so much on your spiritual well-being. And if in fact there is this possibility, or if there could be this possibility that our physical health could match up to our spiritual health, may we strive to be like Gaius. To be walking in the truth. To be people who are lined up to godly standards. And if so be it, if our physical health lines up to that, then it is going to be a blessing and not a curse. So John moves on from verse 3 to verse 4, basically mentioning that it was very evident and obvious that Gaius was walking in this truth. He says, "For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified to the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." So again, it was obvious and it was evident. And now, the following verses, basically, John is going to list. He's going to give examples as to how he was able to evaluate. We know from the Bible, example, Matthew chapter 7, that we are not to judge in the sense of condemnation, but you will know the tree from its fruits. So John is going to list the obvious, the evident fruits that he saw, which is why he could make this claim that Gaius was in fact walking in the truth. So from verse 5 to verse 7, it goes on by saying, Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become followers and workers of the truth. Basically here, the main characteristic quality, action, that is being highlighted here is the fact that Gaius had a servant's heart. Specifically, he was hospitable. He was hospitable to these traveling missionaries. And it was very important, especially in this period of history, for the church to welcome these ministers of Christ who would go all over the place. They had to be welcomed by the local congregations, by believers along the way, so they could literally survive through their travels. And the idea of being hospitable, it's very different than what we throw around in everyday language. When we think of being hospitable nowadays in our current contemporary Western society, it's more along the lines of, okay, Christmas is around the corner, Thanksgiving already passed, and I had to invite Uncle Chester. Nobody likes, I picked Chester because I don't think there are any Chesters here. Right here, currently? Okay. Is anyone's middle name Chester here? No? I'm good? Okay. Nobody likes Uncle Chester. But you're like, okay, tis the season. I will open my doors to Uncle Chester, right? Because he's part of the family. We don't want to isolate him. It's just mean. So I'll just, we'll put him with the kids table. But at least he has somewhere to spend the holidays, right? It's your family, it's your friends. Sometimes, people you don't really like that much, but you're being hospitable. This is not what the Bible means when it utilizes this term. The term hospitality is literally loving strangers. It's a compound term. Here, it's not literally mentioned, but the idea of, dealing with strangers is mentioned, so it's implied. Again, loving strangers. What does that mean? That means loving someone that naturally might not even have the opportunity to love you back. It's one thing for you to love your friends and your family, because even if you are pouring your love onto them, eventually it's going to boomerang back. At least you hope so, because at the very least there's an opportunity, right? They're going to hang around you enough to where you're doing something for them. Eventually you're going to need it, and they're going to do something for you. You invite them, they invite you. You give gifts, they give you gifts. You help them, they help you. That's kind of how it works, at least how it should work. But when you love strangers, sometimes there's even an opportunity for you to receive anything back. And you're just loving for the sake of loving. And you're just loving because it is your duty in Christ. That's hospitality. That's what's being highlighted here. Serving for the sake of Christ with no other intention. No secondary reason for it. So again, Gaius seemingly was a great example of this, to the point where, John is providing him as almost this ideal of walking in truth. But as I mentioned, John also wanted to be thorough, and being an older guy, no longer having those, very fine, tight filters, he just said, heck with it. Let me give you the bad example. There's this dude named Demetrius amongst you. And apparently, it doesn't say here, but apparently he was a person of influence. He was a leader of the church, because what is described here, it could only apply to somebody who actually had power to do some of these things. So let me read that portion to you once more from verse 9 to verse 11, and it says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. So Diotrephes was the anti-Gaius of sorts, right? He was inhospitable and self-serving. He loved to be first and foremost, which again is totally against what I just mentioned pertaining to the qualities that we see in Gaius. He withheld hospitality from, John himself, the leaders of the church, and others as well. He was spreading gossip about, again, said leaders, probably even and including John. And to make matters worse, whenever someone tried to go against his wishes, to maybe even confront him, or to just say, the heck with it, I am going to welcome these people, and I want to be with them, what would this guy do? He would kick them out. So totally different. Completely different. Yet, again, and most likely, this was a leader in the church. How could he do all of this if not? So he was walking. Maybe he was a very eloquent speaker and teacher. Maybe he just had, a demeanor that was very respectful. Authority just oozing from his pores. Maybe well-liked in other regards. Popular guy. Walking. Doing a lot of walking. But not walking in the truth. And John now, he's providing this parallel of sorts. And he's saying, one, you should copy and mimic. The other, you should not. One serves for no reason other than loving someone. The other is self-serving. Does things to benefit himself, even though every once in a while, or maybe even often, it seems like he's doing it for the right reasons. It is not for the right reasons. John then throws another name out there, Demetrius. And very likely Demetrius was the person who was in charge of taking this letter to Gaius. And here it's just a verse that is thrown in there, but basically John, he was recommending Demetrius to Gaius, basically encouraging Gaius to welcome him, to be hospitable to him, because he was a good guy. And then finally, in closing off his letter, verse 13 to 14, it states here, I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you, our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. Very similar to the closing remarks on the previous letter, so we're not going to be very thorough and repetitive. I do want to pick out a couple of things here. First of all, in the portion, excuse me, where it says towards the end, our friends greet you, greet the friends by name. Very likely John was being, even though he was, again, an older guy that probably could care less about people's feelings, he did love the church of Christ and knew these people by name. And maybe even he was mimicking something that was referred to in John 10 when Jesus called himself the good shepherd. And an evidence of that is that the shepherd knows his sheep by name. And even though John didn't have the space nor the patience to write every single name here, he knew that Gaius knew who he was referring to, and he didn't want Gaius to just say, hey, you know what, fellas, guys, John said hi. What he wanted Gaius to do was to go individually, to greet them, and to express the love that John had for them individually. But also, thinking about now this idea of walking in truth, having a little bit more information and some examples to work with. Ultimately, I believe what John meant by people walking in truth is this idea of, once again, being willing to serve for the sake of Christ. In other words, being willing to be a part of the spread of the gospel, both in speech, but also in deed. Because we are called to preach, to share the gospel, to say things whenever suitable, appropriate, whenever we do have the opportunity. But we are also called to do things. And even if we're not going to be the missionaries, even if we're not going to be traveling the world, even if we're not going to be these ministers, on verse 8, reading that portion again, it says, we therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. In other words, in one way or another, we're supposed to be a part of this process for no reason other than the love of Christ. Not because we're going to receive something back, not because it's going to be advantageous to us, not even because it's going to be satisfying or comfortable. Oftentimes it is very uncomfortable to do so. Because again, here within this context, you're literally inviting strangers over. And who likes that? I have my father-in-law over. What a blessing. But very likely, I would have a hard time having just a random stranger over. But again, specifically here within this context, that's what it means. Willingness to sacrifice of yourself, of what you have, of your comforts for the sake of Christ and the expansion of His kingdom and the propagation of His gospel. And especially during this time of year. Why? We're literally celebrating a season where we focus upon God giving us something that we did not deserve, not because He benefits from it, it's because we are the ones who are benefited by that. Christ Jesus, the one and only begotten Son of God, born, given unto us, so that eventually He could grow up and die. And through Him, in that act of selflessness, We who were strangers and estranged are welcomed into God's family, adopted sons and daughters. Shall we not try to do the same? Amen.